Hi, my name is Brooke Thomason. I am a third grade teacher in a small town called Chickamauga, Georgia. I have chosen the topic of students from undocumented families because this is something that is near and dear to my heart. I have several families that I work with in my classroom day in and day out. There are several within our school building that I've been at for 6 years now that come from this type of situation where the students are undocumented or the family members are undocumented, such as the parents, which is causing issues for the family as a whole at times. I also have some friends who work with refugee families, and I have gotten involved with that somewhat as far as trying to find resources for these families as they feel that they are here undocumented and without help and without jobs and without resources to provide jobs or medical benefits. And so I would like to just kind of enlighten you on some of these topics and some of these different situations that are hindering students from undocumented families. Doing a lot of research online with some media, I'd come over some videos that discuss the psychosocial barriers to the undocumented students and discuss the mental health. And while I work with these students day in and day out, it was not something that I had considered necessarily thinking about their mental health. Their physical health, of course, comes to mind very quickly as I work with them on a daily basis, but their mental health is not something that I had truthfully and honestly considered. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that children can also suffer from mental illness and that it's not something that just adults or teenage or senior citizens that adults deal with, and that this is something that our children are dealing with as well in today's society. And that was something that I noticed throughout some research with the media that Cha and Enriquez had discussed some of the mental illnesses and how this affects the families, that the undocumented families, they don't work in fields that offer health or medical benefits, and that this can impact the students and the families with their mental health and how they will go untreated for long periods of time, and how this can have just such a huge impact on these kids and their families, and how these kids are now growing up with a mental illness because they were never able to truthfully receive the proper help that they needed, just because they're undocumented, because they don't feel safe to go into the doctor's offices. They don't feel like they have the resources to be able to go to the doctor's offices, whether it's the insurance or the interpreters, or like just a barrier, like a language barrier that they're not going to be able to understand. So I definitely have seen through the media side of it how this can affect our students. And also just that Serrano and Carriga had also undug a little bit of stereotypes with undocumented families, and how that has become more and more popular in today's society, and that these undocumented families have such a negative connotation to them with certain people, and they may be scoffed at, they may be ignored, and they may be, pushed away from certain things like medical benefits, for example. And that was just something that was merely touched on throughout the media research that was completed about how these families can be stereotyped, and just the disservice that the United States citizens are doing for these families by stereotyping them, and instead of coming out and looking for ways to help. And it is very disappointing to see how American citizens can sometimes be treating these families and these undocumented students. I do think that the students are treated differently than parents at times. In most classrooms, I would like to say that all teachers are treating their students fairly. So I would like to say that the students are being treated fairly. However, when parents and the families are coming in, I don't know that they're always necessarily being treated with that unbiased, fair, equality statement that I would like to say that most would treat them with. But I don't know that for certain when it comes to the families and knowing that they're here undocumented. And so doing this research has definitely opened my eyes, just a more understanding of this topic and this population. And it also just confirmed about how this can affect students being involved with their peers and also their families because of the stereotypes. They're not always welcome with their peers, or because of the undocumentation that the kids have, they're not always able to act on the same thing that their peers are doing. So while, for example, in high school, while the typical seniors are usually going out doing job applications and doing these different things to complete their senior years and their project-based learnings and things such as this, those are some activities that these students from undocumented families are not able to be partaking in due to being undocumented. It's not often that the students are generally undocumented. A lot of the students have been born here and they are documented. It's just their parents and their grandparents and things like that are not. However, there have been certain cases where the students are not documented, and that becomes a problem when you look at high school thing. I mean, it becomes a problem in general, but as far as with their relationship with their peers, in elementary school, middle school, the kids are not looking at each other in that light and thinking, well, are you documented or are you undocumented? And that's not truthfully a conversation that's being had in the lower levels. However, when you get to high school, maybe even older middle school, that maybe become more of a topic, and the undocumented families and the students are they're not feeling as if they are able to relate to their peers as much as they would like to and be able to partake in some of the same activities. So it's definitely having an impact on these families and these students with their emotional health, their mental health, and it can also interfere in their academics as far as when their mental health begins to suffer and they don't feel comfortable at school anymore, around their peers, around their teachers. That's going to have a huge impact on their academic learning as well. There were several questions that I had come up with throughout this research, and I was able to answer a few of them, a lot of them throughout this process, but just for an overview, I had thought about what are U.S. citizens doing to provide resources for undocumented families? How are we as a country providing these documents? We sit around and can say that these families are undocumented and they need to be doing this legally. They need to be going through immigration the correct way. But what are we doing to help? What are we doing to lessen the difficult process? What are we doing as a country to help these families? That is a question that has come up for me throughout the process of this. What revisions could be made to make the process of becoming documented less difficult so these families can be provided the documentation they need without living in fear? So as we're looking at the steps that we can take to be a resource for these families and can help these families with their documentation, how can we also make this process less difficult for these families? These families are coming in very fearful. They come in unknowingly of what's to be expected and the ways that they're going to have to go through this process. So many are just unaware of the process and what all it looks like and what all it takes. So how can we make that less difficult for these families and take off some of the burden for them? How can medical benefits be provided for these families who are undocumented yet have these medical needs? So going back to this mental health, their physical health is just as important. However, mental health can be so serious if it goes without treatment. And so how can we look at some ways to provide medical benefits for these families and they not live in fear going to the doctor because they feel like they're going to be turned in, or because they feel like someone will say something or they will be looked down upon? What are some ways that we can help provide some medical benefits? What resources would undocumented families consider helpful? So we're looking for ways to help them. Why don't we go to them and ask, what do you think would be helpful? What would be helpful for you as you're going through this process? And we can make up these strategies all on our own, but I think truthfully, until we get some feedback from families who are undocumented and are walking through this journey, until we get some feedback specifically from them, I think it's going to be hard to say what resources would they consider helpful unless we're talking directly to them. And where can the gaps be filled to help support these families? So again, just really, really looking at how we can support these families, how we can feel that we're filling those gaps for them, making this a less difficult process for them. While going throughout this research and trying to answer those questions, a lot of interviews that were completed said that they felt that we're merely doing anything to provide resources for these families, and that the resources that these families do have are very, very minimal. And most people that were interviewed had said that they felt like the United States should be providing more resources for these families. One individual even felt that the U.S. does a good job of finding different avenues to communicate with these families by providing documentation, different translations, which could be helpful when going to the border and trying to get the documentation they need. And others had actually mentioned how the school system has been very helpful throughout this process as well, being able to teach the children English and be able to be a support for the children who cannot speak fluently in English. And the school systems have put into place a resource setting for English language learners, students, and providing what they need to be successful in school. So although these students may come to America not knowing any English in the school system, we're doing what we can to provide what these children need to be successful in their learning. And a lot of times it even comes up that our students are our translators for our parents and their families, and their parents are learning through us as well, through our meetings and through conferencing, because they never had someone offer those resources to be teaching them English. And that is something else that thinking about when I have stepped into helping with some refugee families, that was something that was very helpful. These adults were teaching these adults how to speak English, how to read in English, and you're teaching them with these lower level texts. And even though they're adults, they can speak and read fluently in Spanish or just these other languages, but having to really step back and teach the families even how to speak in English and read in English. And so a lot of people felt like the school system has done a very good job of filling that gap for academics, and just trying to be a resource provider for the students to help to not let their undocumentation or their lack of English become a problem for their academic needs. And I had stepped into the question of asking what revisions could make the process of becoming less difficult for these families. And I had several mention the cost of the process. This is such a costly thing for families to have to do. And you have to think, when you're going through documentation, you're not generally trying to just document one person, but you're documenting a family. And that becomes a very, very expensive process for our families. And it just becomes very difficult for these families to even be able to comprehend. And so that's something that if there was just a way for maybe a way to maintain the cost of even just for those that are, let's see, it was very difficult to maintain the cost of just receiving a green card, which is completely separate from actually obtaining a U.S. citizenship status. So even the fact that those are two different costs and two different things, like if there was a way for us to pay the costs, like how are they expected to do that when the individual is not even able to hold a job due to not having a citizenship or a green card? And so it's very difficult to expect these families to come in expecting all this money to be paid up front and be provided this documentation when they're not even able to hold down jobs. When trying to fill some of these gaps or make it less difficult, it was mentioned that maybe it would be beneficial for electronic applications to be placed at the board prior to a scheduled hearing for these undocumented families. And that may be something that's already in place. It's not something that I had seen or that I was able to find in the research, but maybe that would make things a little bit smoother. And again, having that in different languages for the families to be able to read. And it just had individuals discussing that there just seemed to be so many hoops to jump through. And just when you get through one hurdle of obtaining your green card or citizenship and you think you're on the right track for the next thing, then something else is thrown at you. So even if there was just something step by step laid out for these families so they know from the beginning, this is what's expected and I need to have things done in this order. Because it seems as if right now a lot of families have been blindsided by thinking they are on the right track, by thinking they're almost finished, by thinking they are about to obtain that citizenship or that green card, and then they turn around and there's just something else that they have to complete or that they have to get done. So that's just something that I feel it could be a lot less complicated for these families if there was just something for these families to, almost like a checklist for the families to have, and have just more clarity up front about what's expected and what is required. I had a certain family also mention how they felt that it was almost impossible to be able to obtain a green card or U.S. citizenship unless you already had family or a very, very close friend living here in the United States. And I think if we try to provide some ways for families to be able to do that without having to have family prior to being here, I think that's just crazy that it's become that difficult for families to come here, and they shouldn't have to have family or friends already here just to make this process easier for them. We should be able to make that process just as easy from the beginning for them. How can medical benefits be provided for families who are undocumented and have these medical needs? And it was mentioned several times that this should not be a privilege for these families to have medical benefits. This should be a right. Why are these families being treated any different? This is just something that most undocumented families, they're not going to have a social security number. They're not going to have these things in order to have benefits. And these fees should just be waived. We have families, we have children, we have parents, we have all sorts of individuals going untreated just due to lack of documentation. And we are sending more children even and more adults through physical and mental health issues more than ever should have to go through just because of not having documentation. And that's just something that these families here should have a right to, and that medical benefits should not be a privilege of those of U.S. citizens, and that these families should also have that right. It's not a privilege to hold those medical benefits, but a right. I think it's very difficult to say, again, what resources would be helpful for undocumented families, and unless you are an undocumented family. I think it would be very difficult to speak on that. I will say that there were a couple things mentioned in interviews, that something as small as a community outreach to go alongside these families and assist them where they're needed. Because as I said earlier, a lot of families are feeling as if they're never going to be able to attain that U.S. citizenship unless they already have family here or some close friends to walk through that process with them and help them through that. So something as small as a community outreach to be helping these families and just walking alongside them to say, where can I help you? What needs can I do? How can I walk with this through you and support our families as best as possible? There were not undocumented families that I specifically spoke to at this time, and so it's kind of hard to say how we feel that they should be, the resources that they should receive, but based on the other interviews, these are some things that they thought might be helpful. Also, I concluded my interviews asking where the gaps could be filled to help support these undocumented families, and a lot of my responses is just that there's a lot of uncertainty about this process that causes gaps, and how there's a lack of understanding on the part of Americans, and that there's not a focus on what these families are going through. But it's rather just Americans teaching that immigration is wrong and that they shouldn't be here. And it's just a lack of knowledge, I think, for U.S. citizens and Americans, that the focus needs to be on what these families are dealing with and what they're going through, and not teaching other people or slandering other people that this is wrong and that that they shouldn't be here. There should be a support system for our families, and understanding what this process looks like and what would be expected throughout this journey. Again, I think it would just be very helpful if families were able to know up front how they were going to be expected to come through this process. And I think that would be very helpful, but it would also be helpful if we had U.S. citizens reaching out to these families saying, how can I help you? What can I do to be a support for you? Thinking about this in the reality, as I said, I was not able to speak to specific undocumented families, but thinking back to some interviews and some other just conversations that had been had, I think something that was a common trend was a lot of U.S. citizens and Americans feel as if these families at times are criminals, or they're doing something wrong. And I truthfully feel that these families have no awareness of thinking that they're doing anything wrong. They think that they're trying to help their families, and they know that they're trying to better their family, and they're trying to take those steps to better their family and do what they need to do for their children and for themselves to get jobs and better jobs. And so I think that's one thing that people just really need to realize, is that they should not be looked at as criminals or as they're doing something wrong and breaking the law. I think that these families are not necessarily aware at times that it's anything wrong, but they just know in their mind that they're doing the best thing for them and their family, and they are trying to do whatever it takes to do that for them. So looking at the children and how they're undocumented, it can have a big impact on these children, because the children probably don't understand the process of all of this. I have students in my classroom that you can tell they don't truthfully understand. They're third graders. They're anywhere between 8 and 10 years old at times. And I have families who are undocumented. And I don't have as much of a relationship with the families, just because they're not as involved in the school, probably because of this reason, and because they're fearful of coming in, and they're fearful of their lack of knowledge. There are some that I have a great relationship with. I have about, I would say 5 or 6 ESOL children in my classroom. And there are about 2 parents of that 6 that I communicate with on a regular basis, and they feel very comfortable with me. However, there are some that are there, like I said, undocumented, and the students, the children don't understand the severity of it, and but they have mentioned before that that's why their mom or dad doesn't come in to the classroom, or because they're afraid, or that's why the children aren't taken to the doctor when they're sick, because they have no documentation to be able to go. So this is beginning to have huge impacts on our children, but our children don't understand the process of why this is such a big deal. They don't understand why they can't be seen at the doctor. They don't understand why their parents are fearful of coming in. And the children have even said at times, we're not supposed to be here, and I can't go to the doctor because we're not supposed to be here, which is a sad, sad reality for me to see my children hurting, especially physically hurting and sick, and they feel as if they can't go to the doctor, or the parents are fearful of going to the doctor. And it's just it has a big impact on our children. And even at times in some different states, when parents are arrested and taken to the border, it acts as if it's just like a regular defects case, and the children are being taken away and taken into custody as their parents are being arrested and taken back to the border, or being held, and these children do not understand. And I think that's something that's going to have a big impact on our students later on, mentally, and it's gonna harm our students mentally and emotionally, having to live through this process. So that's just something that needs to be considered when thinking of our students and these families and what they're coming from. Another thing that we do feel like that the American citizens have done a good job is providing government housing, education, things such as that for our families. No education is ever denied for these students, and I will say I think that's one place that my students feel comfortable, and they know they are welcome. They know they have no reason to fear being here and at school. But unfortunately, their families and their parents do not feel the same. They weren't raised that way. They weren't raised in the sense of knowing this is a place of comfort for us. This is a place of safety for us. So just unfortunately, these people are seeking that, and they're not able to find that. But I'm so glad that we do offer the education for all of these families, and that government housing can be an option for them as far as helping their income, as some of them may not be able to work yet, or they're working but they're not making a lot of money. So government housing is something that can continue to be beneficial for them. I think a lot of families are becoming overwhelmed with the process of what is expected when trying to become documented. So if there were just ways that we could require less paperwork, it would, or even reduce the waiting time between the periods of the steps of the citizenship, then we could probably close those gaps of why these families are not being able to be provided documentation. Something that was mentioned in a lot of the interviews, and again, this is not through the undocumented families, but a lot of U.S. citizens that I spoke with had said they probably feel as if a lot of the families would feel it beneficial if they were allowed to vote in elections, rather than just limited to the city and the county and the state elections. If they were given options to vote, and then they can voice their reason, they can voice their opinions and what they need and what would be helpful for them. again, it needs to be focused more on a community and not just an every man for himself kind of attitude. And this just goes back to also kind of like the problem lies in not wanting our country to become a socialist state where everybody relies on the government for their needs to be met. But based on the interviews, these undocumented families, most will be expected to learn the English language to be able to communicate effectively. And as far as that, most people are speaking English and things such as that. This needs to be something then that we're providing for them. It cannot just be, you're going to be expected to learn this language if you're going to work here at my job. It needs to be, if you want to work here for me, let me help you teach you the English language. If you're not going to walk alongside somebody and help them through this journey, then you don't deserve that position to begin with. I just personally feel that, just because this is your business or your job, you're no higher than they are and you're not above them. And if you're in a position of leadership, then you should be doing just that and taking that on you to become a leader for them and finding ways to help them and ways to support them. I do feel that most U.S. citizens would put forth the effort in helping undocumented families receive their documentation and become a support system if they just knew the correct ways to provide support. I think a lot of negative connotation has been given for U.S. citizens to be providing support, but I just think if these families knew what kind of support to be providing for these families, it would be a lot more beneficial, and closing those gaps to help these families. And again, just understanding that this is a community. We are here to help each other, and knowing means of being supportive to each other. This is something I've become very sincere about as far as working with families like this and students like this, and I don't think they should be treated any differently. I think they should receive the same things that we are receiving, and yes, there are steps to take, and yes, they may be going about those the wrong way, but that's where we can step in as Americans, as U.S. citizens, to say, let me help you, let me provide this support for you. And in doing that, we can build those relationships with those families. We can lose the fear that they're holding to walk into a doctor's office, to walk into our school buildings, to walk into our business because they're scared. We need to take that away from them. There is no reason for them to hold fear to be living. There's not. These families should be comfortable in their own skin. They should be comfortable in being here and providing for their family just as the rest of us. And I think if we all work together to provide this support, we can make that happen for these families.